Snow-damp air pressed against a tarpaulin. A gloved hand brushed frost from a folded jacket, revealing tangled threads, a single pendant and a business card tucked in a seam. Forensic technicians held their breath, photographing, measuring, and sealing each item, the hush of winter amplifying the precise, inevitable dread itself. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Everything about the scene fit an ordinary, terrible pattern familiar to homicide detectives in cold climates and midwinter cities. A back alley behind strip mall restaurants. A small municipal maintenance shed down an unlit service road. Damp leaves frozen in place, tire tracks half filled with new sleet. The young woman was identified within 48 hours through missing person reports and the slow bureaucratic web of motor vehicle records and college registrar calls. Her name was Caroline Mercer, age 22, with a degree in communications and a plan to spend the holidays in town with an aunt. The clarity of the papers could not erase the vagueness of the why. Police records show an initial suspect list compiled from acquaintances. A man who had been seen arguing with the victim near a downtown bar. 2 former boyfriends with small, messy criminal histories. And a stranger who had been arrested months earlier for a nonviolent property offense near the same neighborhood. Witness statements were transcribed, typed, and filed in the case jacket that would become the permanent bedrock of the investigation. Yellowed pages, marginalia from detectives, and an index of evidence tags that would be consulted for decades. The autopsy report, written in terse, methodical language, included findings that guided rather than sensationalized. Time of death estimated within a narrow range based on rigor and body temperature. Signs of restraint noted without lurid detail to preserve prosecutorial options, and trace evidence collected meticulously. Hairs were recovered from clothing seams, fibers lifted with adhesive tape, and fingernail scrapings catalogued. Swabs were taken for blood typing, and the nascent promise of forensic serology was logged in laboratory notebooks. Those notes are clinical, precise, measurements, reagent lots, technician initials, documents designed to survive scrutiny and to provide a chain of custody that could be read aloud in a courtroom years later. Newspapers in Dallas ran cautious, local headlines. Missing student found. Investigator quotes emphasized ongoing efforts and respect for the family. Local television ran a brief segment the night after the discovery. Images of police tape against sodium lights, and a reporter's voiceover that mentioned a holiday season once full of expectations now threaded with sorrow. The community's response was staunch and modest. Neighbors left single winter flowers at a bus stop where Caroline had once waited. Candles appeared at an intersection, and a small group of volunteers distributed leaflets in neighborhoods between Old Oak and the Midtown corridors. Detectives reconstructed the victim's last known movements from receipts, a cafeteria card log, and campus security notes, establishing a timeline that ended with her leaving a coffee shop on a late December afternoon. She had been seen walking toward the Oak Lawn corridor, where bus service cut late and taxi lines were thin. The city's municipal records provided the cold arithmetic of transit maps. Phone logs, when they could be located, were parsed for numbers and timestamps that might reveal a call or a trace of contact. The early case was managed with the tools available at the time. Fingerprints compared manually against local files. Blood typed into categories. Interviews conducted with careful repetition so memories could be cross-checked. Lead detectives developed a circumstantial pattern. Caroline had accepted a lift from someone she knew. That person left her near the service lane. The last confirmed sighting placed her heading toward that shed. No eyewitness placed a specific vehicle at the scene at the precise time, and no definitive physical evidence tied a named suspect to the location, beyond a shadow of similarity in microscopic hair comparison. Laboratory advances then were limited. Serology could narrow blood types but could not individualize donors. Hairs could be compared under a microscope, offering general matches by color and structure, but not the genetic certainty that would come decades later. The report cataloged a handful of hairs with characteristics similar to one of the men interviewed, sufficient to sustain interrogation and follow-up, insufficient for prosecution. Forensic technicians preserved evidence in refrigeration units and sealed envelopes, documenting each transfer with initials and dates. That meticulous, protocol-driven preservation would prove crucial in ways the original team could not yet anticipate. The belief that tomorrow's tools would render today's ambiguities obsolete formed the persistent through-line of the investigation. Detectives continued to field public calls and to answer letters, balancing procedural language with human weariness. The family received a steady, if sparse, stream of updates. Detectives emphasized procedure, explained the limits of contemporary analysis, and requested patience while acknowledging that patience is a poor substitute for closure. Months became years, and the Caroline Mercer file moved from active docket to cold case status, defined by periodic reviews and quiet attempts to integrate the investigation with regional task forces. The city's cold case unit logged the file and scheduled it for re-examination as forensic advancements unfolded. During the 1990s, several items were retested with improved serological methods, producing clearer blood group categorizations, but no match to known local suspects. Media interest waxed and waned. Anniversary pieces appeared in the local papers at 5- and 10-year marks, cautious retrospectives that emphasized memory rather than new facts. Local historians referenced Caroline's case when writing about Oak Lawn's evolving landscape, weaving the unresolved loss into a broader tale of urban change. The case became a quiet notch in Dallas's ledger of unresolved tragedies. Detectives who worked the original case retired or moved into different roles. New officers reading the cold file treated it with professional curiosity, cataloging preserved items that might yield to new questions. One detective's 2003 addendum recommended that preserved garment seams remain intact for future DNA analysis as technologies improved and costs declined. The notation was procedural, modest, and would later serve as an instruction. Do not discard. Do not destroy. By design, the early investigation avoided speculation about motive beyond observable fact, an opportunistic assault, an escalation of interpersonal conflict, or a predatory act in a place where twilight offered cover. The record emphasized method, evidence collection, witness follow-up, and the maintenance of a legal scaffold that could support prosecution if a name emerged. Public records and police memos reveal a department constrained by caseload, budgetary cycles, and the steady attrition of leads. Persistent through all those constraints was the careful preservation of biological evidence. Envelopes containing swabs and hairs were labeled, dated, and stored. Signatures marked transfers of custody. Those bureaucratic acts, unremarkable at the time, would provide the legal scaffolding for future re-examination when science advanced beyond the capabilities of 1985. Photographs, typed interviews, and laboratory notes sat in cold archives, their edges softened by time, but their contents intact in legal meaning. The city continued to live through winters and holidays. The memory of one December threaded into many, and the public adjusted to living with an absence that never fully resolved. Over the next decades, the family kept a modest ritual alive. A small wreath at the bus stop, a Christmas card addressed to a daughter who would not return, an annual phone call with investigators that became a ritual of mutual care. The aunt collected clippings and filed them in a shoebox. Community advocates lobbied for improved cold case funding, arguing that advancing forensic tools required institutional support. By the early 21st century, consumer DNA testing emerged, and while many law enforcement agencies debated policy and privacy, amateur genealogists formed networks to analyze released profiles, and detectives watched cautiously, aware of thorny legal questions and privacy concerns, yet hopeful that consumer DNA databases might one day provide the missing link investigators lacked for decades and possibly bring overdue legal closure. Remember, the reopening of the Caroline Mercer investigation in the early 2000s coincided with a broader national reconsideration of how cold cases should be approached. Funding allocations shifted, new forensic units were created, and detectives were encouraged to treat old evidence with the same seriousness as active scenes. Dallas law enforcement participated in federal initiatives designed to connect local agencies with more advanced laboratories, offering opportunities for renewed analysis. The Mercer file, still intact and thoroughly documented, was flagged for potential DNA testing once resources became available. Detectives recognized that even a partial profile could help narrow a suspect pool that had grown stale over decades of uncertainty. The preserved garment seams, so carefully maintained, were transported to a partner laboratory for preliminary assessment. Analysts examined swabs stored in sealed envelopes, verifying that temperature stability and chain of custody had remained uncompromised. Several items still contained extractable biological material, a promising indication for next-generation testing. While consumer DNA kits were not originally designed for forensic investigation, genealogical breakthroughs gained attention when cold case units across the country witnessed successful identifications made through distant familial matches. These developments encouraged the Dallas team to consider submitting an anonymized profile to a genealogical research group specializing in law enforcement collaboration. The process required meticulous preparation. Analysts generated a profile from trace material lifted from Caroline's jacket, producing a sequence stable enough for genealogical comparison. The laboratory submitted the profile through lawful channels, ensuring compliance with both federal guidelines and platform-specific policies. Weeks passed without any notable results, but investigators were accustomed to long intervals of waiting. Winter approached once again, and with it came another season marked by the memory of the original December loss. In early November, a genealogist contacted the cold case unit with a lead. The profile matched a distant relative in a public database, suggesting a shared lineage with individuals tied to rural areas outside Fort Worth. Genealogists reconstructed a hypothetical family tree, outlining branches that included several males of the appropriate age during the mid-1980s. The list was small enough to warrant focused investigation. Detectives began cross-referencing names with historical property records, employment information, and archived police contacts. One name surfaced repeatedly in peripheral documentation: a man who had lived near the Oak Lawn corridor during the year of the crime and who had been questioned briefly in an unrelated incident, but never connected to any violent conduct. Investigators reviewed older notes describing the individual as quiet, transient in employment, and known to frequent local bars around the same blocks Caroline had walked. No evidence in the 1985 file explicitly tied him to the crime. At the time, he had not appeared to fit the limited forensic indicators. However, genealogical tracing suggested a high likelihood of shared ancestry between him and the profile constructed from the garment swab. Detectives obtained a discarded DNA sample through lawful, publicly accessible means, allowing the laboratory to conduct a direct comparison. When results became available, analysts reported that the probability of the sample matching the original evidence was astronomically high, effectively confirming a biological link. The suspect, now in his 60s and living in a small Texas town southeast of Dallas, was interviewed under controlled conditions. Investigators approached the questioning with procedural restraint, emphasizing factual patterns rather than emotional appeals. Records indicate that he acknowledged being in the area during the winter of 1985 and admitted to occasional interactions in the neighborhood, but denied any involvement in Caroline's death. Investigators did not rely solely on the DNA evidence. They reconstructed employment timelines, cross-checked vehicle ownership records, and examined archived financial documents. These materials revealed that he had owned a vehicle consistent with tire impressions noted in the initial reports, and witness descriptions from the era placed someone resembling him near the service road on several occasions. Prosecutors evaluated the assembled evidence, focusing on the interplay between biological confirmation and circumstantial reinforcement. Legal precedent indicated that a well-preserved chain of custody, combined with a genealogically linked profile and corroborating historical data, satisfied the threshold for moving forward. A grand jury reviewed the case and returned an indictment. The trial commenced the following spring, drawing careful local media attention. Outlets framed the proceedings as a rare moment of resolution, in a case long considered emblematic of the limitations of earlier forensic science. Court transcripts reveal that expert testimony centered on laboratory protocols, DNA extraction methodologies, and statistical interpretations. Prosecutors emphasized the continuity of evidence storage, demonstrating that preservation practices from 1985 aligned sufficiently with contemporary standards to ensure admissibility. The defense raised questions about environmental degradation, potential contamination, and genealogical inference, but cross-examination demonstrated consistent adherence to procedure. Jurors listened to explanations of allele frequencies, probability ratios, and the significance of matching markers across multiple loci. The verdict, delivered after several days of deliberation, resulted in a conviction for felony homicide. The sentencing phase recognized the unusual temporal span between the crime and the trial, but the court underscored that justice remained applicable regardless of delay. The defendant received a substantial custodial sentence, reflecting the severity of the crime and the enduring consequences for the victim's family. Following the conclusion of the trial, the community revisited the memory of Caroline Mercer in a more resolved light. Local newspapers published retrospectives that highlighted technological progress and acknowledged the dedication of investigators who had maintained the file across multiple generations of personnel. The bus stop, where family members had left seasonal wreaths, became a small, informal marker of remembrance for residents who had lived through the earlier uncertainty. The case entered national discussions as an example of the expanding role of DNA genealogy in resolving long-dormant investigations. Conferences on forensic methodology cited the Mercer file as evidence that thorough preservation practices and methodical archival discipline could support successful prosecutions even decades after physical evidence was first collected. Younger detectives studied the case to understand the interplay between traditional investigative work and modern laboratories, recognizing that neither could function effectively without the other. For the family, closure did not erase loss but replaced uncertainty with settled fact. The aunt who had saved newspaper clippings arranged them in chronological order, compiling a quiet personal record of the decades-long journey. Holiday seasons continued to carry an undertone of absence, But with court documents finalized and a clear account established, the weight of unanswered questions lessened. The city's cold case unit cited the Mercer resolution as justification for continued investment in forensic resources, arguing that similar outcomes might be possible for other families awaiting answers. The broader criminal justice community observed the outcome with measured interest. Training academies incorporated elements of the investigation into coursework focused on evidence integrity, procedural decisions, such as proper labeling or climate-controlled storage, could influence investigative viability decades later. Scholars noted that the Mercer case demonstrated both the strength and limitations of genealogical approaches, acknowledging that such methods must be paired with traditional investigative diligence to withstand judicial scrutiny. Policymakers debated how best to regulate the use of consumer databases while still supporting legitimate law enforcement objectives. Meanwhile, within Dallas, the successful resolution spurred renewed engagement from residents who had once viewed cold cases as immovable fixtures of the past. Community meetings encouraged individuals to share recollections that might assist with other dormant investigations. Retired detectives contributed institutional memory, offering insights into neighborhoods that had transformed significantly since the 1980s. Public trust, often delicate in discussions surrounding forensic methodologies, stabilized as transparent communication highlighted both procedural safeguards and legal oversight mechanisms. For Caroline's extended family, the conclusion of the case marked a transition from active hope to reflective remembrance. They established a modest academic scholarship in her name at a local college, choosing fields related to communications and public service, areas she had shown interest in before her death. Applications for the scholarship requested short narratives describing how students intended to contribute positively to their communities, reflecting the family's desire to transform remembrance into forward movement. Annual awards were presented quietly, without ceremony, reinforcing the family's preference for privacy and composure. As the years progressed, the Mercer case remained an instructive reference point for investigators confronting similar evidentiary challenges. The narrative of careful preservation, incremental scientific progress, and persistent procedural discipline stood as a reminder that even in long-dormant files, potential clarity may lie latent. Though the city continued to evolve, with new buildings rising and older landmarks disappearing, the lessons of the case persisted in the collective professional memory of those tasked with seeking truth across stretches of time. The aftermath of the conviction introduced a new phase in the broader understanding of how dormant evidence fibers, sealed envelopes, and meticulously stored biological traces could reemerge as decisive factors decades later. Investigators who had joined the force long after the original crime found themselves studying archival protocols with renewed seriousness. The Mercer case became a benchmark for how procedural continuity, uninterrupted chain of custody, and long-term preservation could intersect with the steady evolution of forensic capabilities. Internal memos circulated across departments, advising officers to maintain rigorous standards for all collected items, regardless of whether immediate laboratory analysis seemed feasible. This institutional shift reflected a recognition that technology often outpaces expectations, and what appears ordinary in one era may become critically significant in the next. Analysts documented each step of the investigation's revival, citing the value of early technicians who had taken careful measurements, sealed evidence with consistency, and cataloged each sample with signatures that withstood decades of storage. Their diligence prevented future legal challenges, and ensured that the eventual DNA findings were admissible. The judicial closure also prompted reflection on how public databases, consumer kits, and genealogical triangulation had altered investigative landscapes. Panels of legal scholars, civil liberties advocates, and law enforcement officials convened to discuss the implications. The Mercer case, often used as a neutral example, helped frame the ongoing debate about balancing privacy with the pursuit of justice. Neither the prosecution nor defense had relied solely on genealogy. Instead, it served as a navigational tool that narrowed a wide field of possibilities to a manageable list. This balanced application provided policymakers with an illustration of responsible forensic genealogy, avoiding the pitfalls of over-reliance while demonstrating its potential when constrained by legal oversight. Training curricula in forensic programs incorporated the case to emphasize such restraint, encouraging students to view genealogical findings as leads that require thorough corroboration, not definitive conclusions. Prosecutors, too, noted that the case exemplified how circumstantial elements, archival documents, and forensic science can converge without compromising due process. Within Dallas, the resolution subtly influenced community attitudes toward cold cases. Residents who once viewed unresolved investigations as immovable artifacts became more willing to share memories, photographs, or forgotten anecdotes that could assist detectives. The city's cold case division held a small informational event designed to explain how modern tools complemented traditional investigative work. Officers described, in general terms, how DNA profiles could be used ethically and legally to establish potential familial relationships. Attendees, many of whom remembered the era of Caroline's disappearance, expressed cautious optimism that other long-standing cases might eventually find answers. The public's perception shifted from resignation to pragmatic hope, grounded not in sensationalized expectations, but in documented success. Journalists wrote about the growing interplay between community participation and forensic advancement, underscoring how local engagement could fortify investigative efforts. Meanwhile, the Mercer family moved through a period of emotional recalibration after the sentencing. Their experience was marked not by sudden relief, but by gradual acknowledgement that certainty had replaced speculation. They revisited photographs of Caroline, assembling a quiet chronological record of her academic pursuits, volunteer work, and personal ambitions. The scholarship established in her name expanded, drawing applications from students interested in social work, journalism, and advocacy. Letters from recipients described internships, research, and community projects undertaken in her memory. Though these gestures did not diminish the absence, they provided a constructive channel through which her legacy could influence others over time. Family members limited their public presence, choosing instead to commemorate milestone dates privately. The December season, once shadowed by questions, now carried a more settled, contemplative sorrow. Law enforcement personnel continued to review the investigative file even after legal resolution, analyzing which methods proved successful and where earlier limitations had hindered progress. Reports concluded that the earliest stages of the case had been handled with diligence despite the technological limitations of the time. The decision to preserve fibers, hairs, and swabs despite uncertain value was lauded as forward-thinking, even if the original officers had simply followed standard procedure. Recommendations for future cases emphasized comprehensive evidence collection, detailed documentation, and the storage of samples under climate conditions that could sustain biological viability for decades. Departments across Texas referenced the Mercer file when drafting updated archival guidelines, acknowledging that every item preserved responsibly had the potential to become actionable in the future. Nationally, conferences in forensic science highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration, using Caroline's case as one of several instructive examples. Geneticists, genealogists, detectives, and legal professionals discussed how mutual respect for each discipline could prevent misinterpretation or misuse of data. The genealogical lead had not been treated as proof, but as a compass pointing toward individuals who warranted traditional investigative scrutiny. This distinction became an important teaching point. Laboratories stressed the need for transparency regarding methodologies, particularly when presenting results in a courtroom where laypersons must evaluate technical testimony. Defense attorneys cited the Mercer trial as evidence that well-documented scientific processes can withstand rigorous cross-examination when grounded in empirical stability rather than overstated claims. Judges referenced the case in continuing education seminars as an illustration of how modern evidence should be weighed against historical constraints. In Dallas's law enforcement community, new detectives began requesting assignments to the cold case division, inspired by the potential for scientific breakthroughs to illuminate long quiet investigations. Supervisors emphasized that the department's role extended beyond generating arrests. It also involved maintaining the ethical stewardship of stored evidence and respecting the profound human impact of unresolved crimes. The Mercer case served as a reminder that diligence, collaboration, and patience could converge unexpectedly in ways that changed the trajectory of a family's experience. Officers who had participated in the renewed investigation observed how the case bridged generational divides within the department. Veterans contributed institutional memory and context, while younger officers brought fluency in emerging technologies. This collective process forged a sense of continuity across decades of service. The convicted individual's incarceration proceeded without notable incident. Legal reviews affirmed the integrity of the trial proceedings, and appellate courts upheld the conviction based on the strength of the evidence. Media outlets covered the appeals sparingly, focusing instead on broader forensic developments rather than revisiting the specifics of the case. Commentary from legal analysts suggested that the Mercer decision could serve as a reference point for evaluating future cases involving genealogical leads. While the specifics varied widely across jurisdictions, the underlying principles, transparency, proper chain of custody, corroborating evidence, and careful judicial oversight remained constant. Analysts emphasized that the public's confidence in forensic innovation depended largely on maintaining these standards. In the months following the resolution, scholars and criminologists conducted retrospective analyses exploring the social context surrounding the original crime. They examined how the landscape of Dallas in the mid-1980s, with its evolving urban corridors and shifting transportation patterns, created vulnerabilities that investigators had struggled to address with limited tools. These studies contextualized the case within broader patterns of urban change, acknowledging how environmental factors and social dynamics influence crime and investigation. Articles in academic journals compared the Mercer case with others solved through genealogical techniques, highlighting similarities in evidence preservation and differences in investigative timing. Such studies reinforce the idea that long-term storage protocols and accurate documentation were among the most influential determinants in whether a cold case could be solved after decades. For the community, the case gradually settled into the background fabric of local history. Residents who remembered the original investigation spoke of it less frequently, though the memory resurfaced during anniversaries or in conversations about technological progress. Students studying criminal justice at nearby colleges visited the cold case unit during educational programs and often asked about the Mercer case, treating it as a practical model of forensic evolution. Officers emphasized that the case, while important, represented only one example among many, and encouraged students to understand it as part of a much larger continuum of investigative practice. The Dallas Archives, once a repository of dormant files, gained renewed attention as analysts began reevaluating which cases might benefit from modern reanalysis. The Mercer file remained in its dedicated storage location, now accompanied by updated documentation summarizing the steps that led to its resolution. Archivists reference the case when discussing grant proposals aimed at improving storage capacity, digitizing older files, and integrating laboratory workflows with long-term evidence preservation systems. City officials recognized that investing in these areas could support future resolutions and strengthen public trust. By the end of the year following the trial, the holiday season arrived with a quieter tone for those connected to the case. Investigators reflected privately on the long arc leading from the original discovery to the final verdict. The December air that once carried uncertainty now held a sense of measured closure. The Cold Case Division used the season to conduct its annual review, acknowledging the persistence of families still awaiting answers. The Mercer case served as both motivation and reminder. Resolution is possible, but only when evidence, science, and human diligence remain aligned over time. Communities evolve, landscapes change, and decades accumulate, yet the disciplined preservation of a single fiber, swab, or record can become the key to unlocking truth after years of silence. In the period following the resolution of the Mercer case, law enforcement agencies began to integrate its lessons into formal procedure, treating it as a structural example of how older investigations could benefit from new methodologies while still honoring the work of original detectives. Analysts across the country cited the case when discussing best practices for storing biological material, noting that the durability of the evidence had only been possible because technicians in 1985 had followed protocols that were, at the time, considered routine rather than visionary. The durability of those samples suggested that the boundaries between past and present were far more permeable than once thought, and that cases once considered entirely dependent on eyewitness testimony or early forensic tools could in fact be reanimated by scientific developments long after communities had resigned themselves to uncertainty. Academic institutions used the Mercer timeline as a template for teaching the mechanics of evidence preservation, illustrating how controlled temperature, sealed containers, and uninterrupted documentation could become as important as laboratory innovation. This shift in institutional thinking encouraged departments to reconsider the value of dusty shelves, older filing systems, and aging storage freezers that had once seemed destined for quiet obscurity. As these conversations developed, the city of Dallas reviewed its long-term archival strategies, recognizing that the Mercer outcome had demonstrated the tangible benefits of diligence applied across generations. Officials allocated modest funding toward improving storage conditions and digitizing older case files, ensuring that paper documents susceptible to environmental deterioration could be scanned, encrypted, and preserved beyond the degradations of time. The goal was not merely technological modernization, but an acknowledgement that the past, when properly maintained, held practical value for the present. Archivists cataloged evidence in ways that allowed investigators to track item histories without sifting through deteriorating folders. The Mercer case, once a quiet entry in a long ledger of unsolved crimes, became an administrative catalyst for processes designed to protect the integrity of information for decades beyond its initial collection. The city recognized that cold cases did not signal stagnation, but represented opportunities waiting for the right scientific or procedural bridge to appear. Families of other missing persons observed these efforts with a sense of tempered anticipation. While no single case could promise the same trajectory, the successful resolution demonstrated that persistent maintenance of evidence offered pathways to clarity even after long delays. Advocates met with detectives to discuss ethical ways genealogical resources might support ongoing investigations, while remaining respectful of privacy and legal constraints. These meetings did not promise breakthroughs, but created an environment in which families could see tangible commitment from the justice system, reducing the emotional weight of silence that often accompanies unsolved cases. For many, the Mercer resolution became a symbol of possibility rather than a guarantee, illustrating how patience, procedure, and scientific advancement could converge unexpectedly. Detectives took care to manage expectations, emphasizing that each case required its own investigative journey, shaped by available evidence and the passage of time, yet acknowledging that persistence remained meaningful. In the forensic community, laboratories continued refining techniques that had been instrumental in the Mercer investigation. Analysts developed improved methods for extracting genetic material from samples previously considered too degraded for use, drawing inspiration from the long-preserved fibers and swabs that had unlocked the path to identification. Workshops emphasized the importance of cross-disciplinary communication between genealogists, laboratory scientists, and detectives, underscoring how misinterpretation could be avoided when each field clearly articulated its limitations and strengths. The Mercer case often appeared in presentations as a model of effective collaboration, demonstrating that success depended not only on innovation but on mutual accountability. Researchers stressed the value of restraint in interpreting genetic distances and urged careful consideration of probability calculations before presenting results to investigators or legal teams. This insistence on precision reinforced public trust in forensic processes, which had expanded significantly during the decades since the original investigation. Meanwhile, within the prison system, the convicted individual's life shifted into the routine patterns typical of long-term incarceration. Records indicated compliance with institutional expectations, limited disciplinary incidents, and no significant behavioral changes over time. The appellate pathway narrowed as courts confirmed the robustness of the trial, leaving little room for reinterpretation of the evidence. Legal scholars reviewed the case as an example of how genealogy-assisted investigations could withstand judicial scrutiny when supported by a rigorous evidentiary chain. Commentaries highlighted that the conviction did not hinge on a single element but on a constellation of factors: preserved biological material, contextual historical documents, witness recollections, and careful analysis of archival records. The integrity of those elements strengthened confidence in the verdict, ensuring that the resolution rested on substantive foundations rather than novelty. In the broader cultural landscape, the Mercer case subtly shifted public narratives surrounding cold cases. Documentaries, academic papers, and regional histories referenced it as part of a growing tapestry of investigations revived through forensic genealogy. These references avoided dramatization, instead situating the case within a realistic portrayal of investigative persistence. The story resonated not for its sensational elements, but for its demonstration of how steady procedural discipline could alter lives even after decades of quiet stagnation. Writers examining the evolution of forensic science noted that cases like Mercer's revealed the cumulative nature of progress. Each scientific improvement built upon the discipline of earlier practitioners, and each preserved sample represented a potential bridge between eras. This interpretation emphasized continuity rather than spectacle, aligning with the restrained tone preferred by those closest to the case. For the Mercer family, the passing years brought new rhythms shaped by the coexistence of loss and closure. They maintained the scholarship in Caroline's name, reviewing applications each spring and selecting recipients whose aspirations reflected her interests. The scholarship committee, composed of family members and community representatives, approached the process with a quiet sense of purpose, recognizing that the award served both as tribute and as a means of fostering constructive contributions to society. Recipients occasionally wrote letters of gratitude, describing research projects or community programs they pursued as part of their studies. These letters were saved in a folder kept alongside Caroline's preserved belongings, forming a modest but meaningful record of how her memory continued to influence the lives of others. The family no longer engaged with public discussions of the case, choosing instead to honor her through private reflection and small annual gatherings. In law enforcement offices, detectives continued identifying cold cases that might benefit from the same methods applied in the Mercer investigation. Some files yielded promising leads, while others remained constrained by incomplete evidence or deteriorated samples. The Mercer case served as a reminder of inherent limitations as much as possibilities, encouraging investigators to approach each file with measured expectations. Cold case units implemented new review schedules, ensuring that cases were periodically revisited as forensic tools evolved. Teams adopted structured assessment checklists, examining factors such as sample viability, historical documentation, witness accessibility, and potential genealogical relevance. While these measures did not guarantee resolution, they increased the likelihood that viable cases would receive timely attention rather than fading indefinitely into archival obscurity. Community members, observing these efforts, engaged more openly with law enforcement. Residents who had lived in Dallas during the 1980s occasionally approached detectives to share recollections prompted by media coverage of the Mercer resolution. While many memories had faded, some contributed subtle contextual details about neighborhood patterns, transportation routes, or social environments relevant to other investigations. Detectives recorded these accounts without assuming undue weight, understanding that even peripheral information could sometimes direct attention to overlooked elements in existing files. This renewed public engagement exemplified a shift toward collective responsibility, reflecting a recognition that the search for truth often extends beyond institutional boundaries. Across academic and professional circles, the Mercer case continued to hold significance as a point of reference for evaluating investigative evolution. Researchers studying criminal justice reform included the case in discussions about the importance of long-term resource allocation for evidence preservation. Workshops on ethical considerations in forensic genealogy used the case to illustrate balanced applications, highlighting its reliance on corroboration rather than probabilistic inference alone. Publications examining the history of forensic science traced a direct line from early serology to the sophisticated genetic sequencing that ultimately resolved the case, demonstrating how each stage of progress expanded the landscape of what was investigatively possible. In time, the case settled into the quiet permanence that accompanies resolved histories. The service road where Caroline's belongings were found underwent redevelopment, transforming into a more structured commercial corridor. The bus stop where her family placed wreaths was relocated during urban renovation, but the family continued to honor the season privately, aware that the physical landscape had changed, while the emotional landscape remained consistent. For investigators, the Mercer resolution became part of departmental lore, an affirmation that patience and procedural rigor could converge across years, linking the aspirations of past detectives with the capabilities of modern science. By the close of the decade, the lessons derived from the case had become institutionalized, shaping protocols in evidence management, genealogical collaboration, and cold case methodology. The story no longer circulated as active news, but as a professional benchmark, a measured reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could emerge through the cumulative efforts of individuals separated by time but united in purpose. Communities continued to commemorate Caroline's life through the quiet impact of the scholarship, through informed advocacy for forensic resources, and through renewed appreciation for the long arc of investigative dedication.